Um, we're so very pleased to have Senator Murkowski here. She's a leader in the Senate on many different issues, particularly on energy, on renewable energy, on increasing energy efficiency, on making America's energy more reliable. From a national security perspective, Senator, which I've always valued about your service in the Senate is your emphasis on the Arctic as a national security issue, to increase the number of icebreakers available to the United States, and to take the Arctic as a national security issue seriously. And you've introduced legislation to that effect. So thank you for that. Thank you for agreeing to interview with us. And I'll turn this over to Peter Baker. I think most people on this Zoom call know that Peter has covered the last 4 presidents for the New York Times and Washington Post. He's the chief White House correspondent for New York Times, and along with his wife, Susan Glasser, they've written a magnificent book on one of our great secretaries of state, James A. Baker III, the man who ran Washington. I've read it, and I encourage everyone to go out and buy it. Peter, take it away. And Senator Murkowski, thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks, Nick. Thank you very much. And thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here with everybody today. Thank you, Senator, for being with us. It's going to be, I hope, a fun, if short, conversation as we try to squeeze in a lot in a very short amount of time. But thank you for taking the time. Senator, you were in Reykjavik in May for the most recent meeting of the Arctic Council. And at this point now, the chairmanship of the council is turning over to Russia for the next 2 years. We're at odds with Russia on so many different fronts right now. Our relationship probably hasn't been as bad as it's been right now for many, many years. What do you anticipate are the big challenges in having Russia in charge of this council, given that the Arctic is one more area where we have significant disagreements with Moscow about?
Well, Peter, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to have this dialogue with you and to the Aspen Studies Group. I appreciate this. We're talking about a subject that I spend a lot of attention on, a lot of focus on, and have for years and years. You mentioned our relationship with Russia. I have been part of what we call the Arctic Parliamentarians. This is a group of parliamentarians from the 8 Arctic nations. We gather several times a year. I've been participating for probably 15 years now. And it's been interesting because there has been an acknowledgement in our working circles that even while Moscow and Washington, D.C. and our leaders may be at odds on other issues, there is an ability to talk about the Arctic in a way and in a manner that allows for fruitful discussion, that allows for a level of cooperation. Now, that is not always the case. We know and we recognize that. But I do think that the Arctic presents opportunities for discussion and discourse with Russia, even at a time of very heightened tensions. Now, you mentioned the Arctic Council and the fact that Russia now has the chairmanship. Remember, there are other Arctic forums. The Arctic Circle you mentioned, I was in Reykjavik in May. There are venues where we can be coming together with our Arctic partners that are perhaps outside of some of the political discussions that may come about in the Arctic Council initiative. So I have long viewed that while we may have our challenges with Russia, and we certainly do at this moment in time, that if there is one area that we ought to be able to have discussions about, whether it is the environment, whether it is indigenous peoples, whether it is the search and rescue, oil spill prevention, there are areas that we can be working together. And that gives an opportunity where perhaps at this time in this place, it's more challenged.
Thank you for that. The Russians are investing a good deal into this idea of a Northeast Passage, what they call the Northern Sea Route, which will become a commercial success, they believe, because of global warming, because of the change in our climate. What's our strategy for this newly opening route? And should we acquiesce to Russia, which is asserting that any passage through there requires their permission? And if we don't abide by that, if we don't acquiesce to that assertion on their part, what is our plan if they, if they push it, basically? In other words, what are our options as you see it?
Well, first quick answer is no, we don't acquiesce. Again, how we are working together to better define the rules of the road, if you will, coming down through the Bering Straits. You basically have 57 miles between the United States, Alaska, and Russia. How are we dealing with issues of transit through these waters? There's the Coast Guard Forum that I think is a significant opportunity. It has been an area where, once again, you can have leadership from the two countries that are coming together to focus on areas of cooperation, search and rescue. The chiefs of the Arctic Defense Forum, this was terminated back so this was about 6-7 years ago, I guess it was, after the Crimea annexation. So is this an opportunity to bring that back? I think at the bottom line to all of this is that there has to be communication back and forth. And so how we engage, I think, is important. I will just say it's not necessarily in keeping with your question, but I raise it because I have long been an advocate for ratification of the law of the sea. It doesn't have to do with channels of transit like you're talking about, but when we're talking about the areas of the Arctic that are clearly defined and where they aren't so clearly defined, I feel it's important that the United States truly have a seat at that table. And without having ratified the law of the sea, there is an absence there. And so is that a limiting factor in our discussions going forward? I think that that's something that we need to be talking about.
Talk about Alaska specifically in this regard. What's the consequence? What's the stake for Alaska in terms of perhaps missing out on this new trade, given this passage, this sea route that the Russians are talking about?
Well, from a trade perspective, it is important that Alaska is a participant. It's not as if we have a great deal of a product for export, but our reality is that if we fail to build the infrastructure on the US side along the Alaska coastline there, whether it is a deep water port at Nome or Kotzebue, whether it's opportunity for search and rescue platforms out in St. Paul, St. George, whether it is resupply in Dutch Harbor. If we haven't built this out, you've got it right across the water there on the Russian side. So we miss out on that in terms of a servicing and a supply. And again, the ability to be a broader participant in what we're seeing moving through these very narrow waterways. Another thing that I will just raise in this conversation, it was just last year, alarms ringing to the Coast Guard, and actually my staff was on the receiving end. We had Alaskan fishermen that were out in the Bering Sea area, and they were literally buzzed by Russian bombers. There were naval frigates that were in the water, very, very threatening to those fishermen. They were basically forced to cut their nets and move out of these waterways. Russia says it's an exercise, but it was the most significant exercise of this type that we have seen in decades. So it's not just about transit, it's about how we are using these waters here and the manner in which we are using them. It goes back to what I just mentioned, and that is, how are we communicating with one another? Whether we like our neighbors or not, Russia is pretty dang close to us. And so how we communicate, how we share information in a way that recognizes the mutual areas of cooperation that have to go on when you have these shared waterways, at the same time that you have the political issues in front of us. It is a challenge.
Russia has so much of its territory, either in or connected to the Arctic Circle, much more than we do, obviously. And they take this so seriously. I ask this because some of our colleagues, some of our reporters were recently in St. Petersburg at the invitation of Rosatom, which is the Russian nuclear company, as you know. And they showed off 3 nearly finished nuclear icebreakers, the Ural, the Yakutia, and the Sibir. Each of them cost about $1 billion, and they're building 2 more, one that's going to be twice as large as these existing models. And my understanding is the US Coast Guard, we're planning for some polar security cutters, but that there's a funding issue, and that right now the Coast Guard only has 2 icebreakers and neither of them is nuclear powered. I guess I'm curious from your point of view, are we doing enough to keep up? Is this a new competition in effect between us and Russia? And if it is, what do we need to do to make sure we're competitive?
Well, I'm only smiling because you asked the simple question, are we doing enough to keep up? And my answer has been flat out no. We haven't been doing enough to keep up for a long time. The fact that the Arctic I've been here in the Senate now almost 20 years, and for the first half of my tenure here, whenever I raised the subject of the Arctic, people thought it was just an Alaska only issue. It's like an Alaska earmark. Believe it or not, when I first brought up the need for polar security cutters for icebreakers, they basically said, well, Murkowski's looking for an earmark for her state. It is not about Alaska. It is about the fact that the United States is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. So let's behave like one. Let's be a participant in this. The fact that we don't have an Arctic ambassador, the fact that we have been so late to the game, when it comes to the assets that we need to be a real participant, you've got to have the ability to work in the Arctic. So yes, we've made good headway of late. We have 3 polar security cutters that are in the works. The first one will come, will be finished, completed in 2024. So 3 more plus 3 more smaller ones are online. So we are working towards the funding, and that has been significant. But to your point, the problem that we have is we have 1 operational icebreaker right now, 1. And it's serving full-time down in Antarctica, doing the plow out for McMurdo. We saw it in Alaska this past summer, for the first time in decades. And the only reason it was there was because COVID had basically closed out the refueling mission. And so we got a polar security icebreaker, a polar class icebreaker up in the Arctic for the first time in decades. What's wrong with this picture? Well, let me tell you. You mentioned what Russia is building up, and they are very aggressive in advertising it all. They're not hiding it from anyone. They want to show Arctic dominance. But I was over in China a few years back at an Arctic Circle meeting in Shanghai, and they were advertising with great bravado that they too were building their second nuclear powered icebreaker with more icebreakers on the line. They call themselves a near Arctic state, whatever that may be. It should get the attention and hopefully get those competitive juices of Americans flowing when they look around and they see all of these other countries that are engaging in the Arctic, that are putting resources towards the Arctic. And they should ask the question, where are we? How prepared are we? We're going to have a gap between the time that the Polar Star, which is operating now, has to be retired. She's on her 2nd round of a makeover and doesn't have too many more useful years. By the time the first one gets done, we will have 1 out in the water. And where is that ship going to go? Down to Antarctica to fulfill the mission there. What's happening up in the Arctic? Wide open space. We do have a medium strength icebreaker, the Healy, that has been working hard. She had a tough year last year with a fire, but it's not the capability. It's not the polar class icebreaker. And so we are behind. Long answer to your very simple question. We are behind and we got to get cracking.
Sarah, thank you very much. I'm glad we were able to talk about this, because I think it's an often overlooked frontier in terms of our foreign policy and as well as our national security policy. So thank you very much for joining us at this point. I'm going to turn it back over to Nick Burns, and I think we're going to continue, I think, with one of your colleagues shortly.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. Thanks for drawing attention to the Arctic as a national security imperative, because I think a lot of us are very much in agreement with you on that.
Thank you. We got a lot of work to do.
Much. Thank you. And we're now going to welcome our